So today, when we're talking about securing your Exchange environment or securing your servers, we're really talking about things that can affect the messaging environment. Those unwanted messages, so anti-spam, antivirus, anti-malware, in some case encryption, and of course the policy and reporting aspects that go along with those features as well. So let's look at some statistics here. Anti-spam. Just out of curiosity, when we're talking worldwide email traffic, how many email messages would you imagine are sent globally every single day? Just kind of raise your hand or just shout it out if you think you know the answer. Or if you just want to take a guess. Would you say it's millions? Billions. You'd say it's billions. Well, it works out to be about 2.9 million messages every second. Now, I say about because, quite frankly, no one knows. It's impossible to count. This is statistics that come from Radicati Group and other organizations that do some tracking of message traffic, but quite frankly, it's just impossible to know. But we estimate, though, given the information that we can look at and extrapolate from, we estimate that it's almost about 3 million messages every single second of every day. And so what that works out to be is about 300 billion messages every day, or about 100 trillion messages every single year. Now that's worldwide traffic, that's all email traffic, regardless of whether it's going through an Exchange server or not. And it also includes messages that don't traverse the internet as well. So these could be internal messages as well. Now, let's look at Exchange Online email traffic. How much of that traffic do you think comes into Exchange Online every single day? Again, go ahead and just shout out a guess if you want. Don't be shy. All right, well, I'll tell you. It's about 1.3 billion messages per day. So that's a fair and healthy amount of email traffic coming in. And what we've seen is about 740 million of those messages are spam, or what we would categorize as unsolicited commercial email, or the kind of unwanted messages that you might find in your junk email folders. And so obviously that's a tremendous amount of messages that need to be filtered out by the system before they get into anyone's inbox. And that, by the way, is just Exchange Online. That does not include, for example, messages that traverse through your on-premises systems that come and grow across the internet and go to other messaging services other than Exchange Online. And so this is what we see every single day, well over 1 billion messages getting processed in some form through Exchange Online and some of its ancillary services like Exchange Online Protection and Exchange Hosted Encryption. So when we talk about anti-spam, and for those of you who've been running Exchange for a while, this will probably be somewhat of a refresher for you. But when we talk about anti-spam, particularly from an Exchange perspective, Exchange has a history over the past several releases of using what we call a multi-layered approach, or a defense in-depth approach to blocking unwanted messages from your organization or from your tenant subscription in Office 365. So what happens is messages will come in and they'll be filtered through a number of different mechanisms until they're whittled down to just those messages that you really find to be legitimate messages and that you would want to enter your messaging system and be delivered to recipients in your organization. So some of the layers we have are things like connection filtering. And connection filtering is actually one of the best mechanisms that we have for blocking unwanted messages. It ends up roughly blocking about 80% of all unwanted messages. And that's generally across the board. That applies equally to both on-premises and cloud-based deployments. Connection filtering is basically IP allow and IP block, looking at the actual sending server of that message, determining or not whether that server is reputable and whether or not we should accept messages from that server. Now, some of the blocking that gets done happens automatically through things like the Microsoft Reputation Service, but other blocking can happen through administrator actions, or unblocking can happen as well. So the administrator has control where they can say, yes, accept all messages from this server with this IP address, or block all messages from this server with this IP address, or servers within a range of IP addresses. Assuming a message does make it through the connection filtering layer, the next process is going to be the sender and recipient filtering. So you may be familiar with the concept of the safe sender lists or block sender lists that you have in Outlook. That's basically what we're talking about here. We're evaluating the senders and we're evaluating the recipients to figure out, once again, if we should accept these messages into the organization. Now, sender and recipient filtering, because it requires quite a burden on the administrator to maintain those lists, or burden on the end users to create their own safe and block sender lists, it is not as effective as connection filtering. Approximately 15 to maybe 20% of the remaining messages will get filtered out through sender and recipient filtering. And then there's content filtering. Once we've decided that the sending server is okay, the sender is okay, and the recipient is okay, the next thing we need to do is examine the content itself in the message and determine if it's legitimate or if, in fact, it has some form of hostile content, malware, viruses, and again, spam that you wouldn't want in your organization. Typically, that's going to block about 5% of the remaining messages. So connection filtering, I already talked about the fact that you have this concept of an IP allow and IP block list. And these are lists, again, that the administrator can maintain. They can maintain them both through the Exchange Admin Center, which is the GUI interface for Exchange 2013, replacing both the Exchange Control Panel and the Exchange Management Console in previous versions. Or they can use PowerShell to do a bulk importing of a whole range of IP addresses if they want to block on bulk that way. There is also this Microsoft Reputation service that I mentioned where customers have the ability to opt in. It is somewhat similar to a real-time block list where it's a list of reputable senders, and those senders are checked against the master list that's maintained by Microsoft. And if the sending servers are reputable, they'll be on that list. If the sending servers are not reputable, they may end up with what we call a spam confidence level score that is much higher than reputable senders. Now, what's interesting about the reputation service is not just anybody can get on there. What you'll find, particularly if you're a small organization, you might not actually have a sufficient quantity of email traffic to qualify you for that list. You really have to send quite a bit of email over an extended period in order for you to build up reputation for your servers. Now, the fact that you're not on our sender reputation list doesn't mean that you're not a legitimate sender. It is just one point of the message criteria that gets looked at as far as the overall evaluation process goes. Now, in terms of the confidence levels we have, there's basically two levels. We've got the obvious spam, and those are things that we track through things like spam campaigns that we know about. We have a very large clearinghouse at Microsoft that tracks these things as they're occurring on the internet. And so we know literally on a day-to-day or sometimes an hour-to-hour basis what campaigns are occurring on the internet, what bulk email messages are going out, and to whom they're going out, and from where they're originating. And we can use that information to really hone in on some of these messages and instantly determine whether or not they're spam or legitimate messages. And that's true whether they are English-based or localized into a variety of different languages. Then there's also the high confidence spam, and that's where it's nothing that's on our radar, but based on message characteristics, we can have a fairly high confidence level that this is an unwanted spam-like message. So something that might be selling you some sort of medical solution for something that ails you is a good example of that. And when it comes down to the content filtering, well, that is a variety of metrics that we look at, not just the subject and the message body, but also any attachments that are associated with those messages as well. And the actions that you have available to you, you can delete the messages, you can quarantine them, you can add additional headers if you have a anti-spam gateway that you want to do further processing on. You can also modify the subject. A lot of organizations are doing things like adding the word spam into the subject to help identify this as a potentially unwanted message. Or you can redirect the messages to an administrator or group of administrators for things like moderation and approval as well. So let me talk about some of the spam controls that we have. You're actually looking at a screenshot of the user interface, and whether you use the Exchange Admin Center in Exchange Online or your on-premises Exchange Admin Center, the options that you have are going to be largely identical. You'll see later on that there are some reporting capabilities that are available in Exchange Online that don't yet exist in Exchange on-premises. But you have the ability to do quite a few things. For instance, if you see things like JavaScript or iframes being used in HTML-based messages, you can automatically block those messages as unwanted. Generally speaking, and again, generally doesn't apply to all messages, but generally speaking, there are a few legitimate uses for JavaScript or inline frames inside HTML messages. There are some legitimate uses, yes, but these things are typically common exploits that are used by spammers to get you to do things on your system, or just to get you to open the message so that they can run a script and have these things tracked in the form of web beacons. And other things inside the HTML, if there's web bugs, which could be a little beacon that's sending back to a server. These can be invisible pieces inside the mail message that a user doesn't even see, but once they open it, it makes a silent connection back to the sending server. Why does it do that? Because it tells the sender that they found a legitimate recipient. And for a spammer, most of the money that spammers get does not come from the actual spamming itself. It typically comes from reselling of legitimate and verified email addresses. So the products that the spammers are trying to sell you really doesn't buy them much of a profit. If at most, they end up getting about 1, maybe 2% rate of return for people who would actually open those messages and buy one of those products. But what they're really trying to do is just verify that they've got a good email address, because that's just like gold to them. And if they've got valid email addresses, that's something they can package up with the other ones that they've collected and resell to other spammers. And that's really where the money is located. You can also do things like just block all bulk email messages. So if there is a bulk email campaign that you know of or that we know of going around, these can just automatically be blocked as soon as they're inspected by the Exchange server themselves. So that's something where it's just a toggle switch. You turn it on, you turn it off as needed. Typically what will happen is most customers will go ahead and turn it on. And I haven't heard from a single customer that's turned it on that's ended up with any false positives or legitimate messages that have been rejected. Now, that isn't to say that this feature is perfect and that it can't happen, but I have yet to hear of a single customer reporting that to us. And so we're basically using, fingerprinting technologies on the messages themselves to determine whether or not they're legitimate. Again, our clearinghouse is very good at understanding what is traversing on the internet, again, on an hourly or daily basis. Yes?
You had the SPF record there.
Yes.
Hard fail.
Yes.
And shouldn't that be a soft fail? Hard fail is a connection fail.
Yes. So that is your choice. So we have the ability to do both. So if you want it to be a soft fail, where we'll just mark it inside the header and up the spam confidence level to acknowledge that, you have that choice as well. But if you want, you can also just block that as soon as you see that as well. A lot of customers will not do the hard fail on SPF because they recognize that although it's been recommended now for a few years, not every domain out there has SPF records associated with it. We would like them to be the case because it's a fantastic way of legitimizing a domain and, more importantly, preventing your own domain from being spoofed, but not every customer does that. Now, international spam, I'm sure that's very relevant and germane here, as well as other regions. We have the ability to block what we would call localized or regionalized spam. And we can do that based on the language. And we basically have every language, all the languages of the 194 nations in the UN listed here, or we also have all of the different countries that are listed as well. So there may be some countries that flat out really have no legitimate reason for sending your organization messages, and you can block all of those messages. Or you may find yourself getting spam by a particular language as well, and you can block on a language basis if you choose. Now, for junk mail management, assuming the messages get past all the filtering that's done on the server side, then there's junk mail management that is done by the end users in terms of Outlook or Outlook web app in their junk mail folder. Our recommendation is still that you allow the messages to go to the user's mailboxes, but that they get placed in the user's junk mail folder and not in their inbox. And that works out very well. That's what we do here at Microsoft, and that's what happens with my own personal mailbox here. And that has proven to be very, very effective. I don't get any unwanted messages inside my inbox. I do see a few getting through and into my junk mail folder, but that's very easily reported back to MSIT, and they can go ahead and add any further constraints. We've got very good internal spam reporting as well. The other thing that we give users the control over is their own safe sender and block sender lists. And those can get aggregated up to your transport servers such that on a per user basis, one user's unwanted sender might be another user's legitimate sender. Common example might be an email subscription or an email from a company with, that the user has done business with. Some users just decide that they don't want messages from that company anymore, but they've also been taught that it's not always a good idea to use those unsubscribe links at the bottom of the messages. Because in many cases, the unsubscribe links, yes, they might take you off the list, but in doing so, they'll also verify your email address, and they'll be able to validate that they found a good email address. And again, that kind of information can be resold even by legitimate senders. So we give the users the ability to control that through their own Outlook mechanisms, and they can block a sender, they can block a domain, or they can also allow all messages from a sender as well. Now, for messages that you decide to take quarantine actions on, though, that is always and only managed by the administrator. There's a quarantine mailbox that is accessible only by the administrator, and if you are using the quarantine feature, periodically the administrator will need to go into that mailbox and either clean those messages out, or if there are legitimate messages in there, they'll need to go and re-inject them into the transport pipeline so that they can be delivered to the recipient. That, again, whether you quarantine or block or delete, is going to be a choice that each organization makes for themselves. Now, in terms of spam, we do have an end-user spam notification capability, and that is also localizable as well, so it doesn't necessarily need to be in English. It can be in other languages as well. And these notifications can tell an end user that, yes, in fact, there's been spam detected, and do you want to take further action on this, like unquarantine a message or validate that this is actually an unwanted piece of mail. And again, you're seeing the screenshots there inside the Exchange Admin Center. This is going to look largely the same whether you're using online or on premises. Not too many customers, I find, are using the spam notification. In fact, many that I've talked about really feel like that notification is kind of another piece of spam itself. In other words, we didn't send you this message, but we're telling you about it, so you're kind of getting spammed anyway as a result of that. Yes, sir?
Can you set spam notification to notify the end user if the spam confidence level is somewhat?
So great question. So if you didn't hear that, can you control whether or not you notify the end user based on the SCL, the spam confidence level? We don't have that granular control. All you can see here is this. This is really all you get here is send the notification from anywhere from 1 to 15 days and then choose your language. So it's not directly, you don't have control over which SCL values trigger this notification, but you do have control over which SCL level would be considered spam. So in setting that level, based on the action, in that context, you would sort of have control over it. But it would be every message that was that SCL level or greater that would trigger that. You wouldn't have the granularity saying, 5 for this user, 7 for that user, and so forth. Now, in terms of reporting unwanted messages, we've got a couple ways that you can do that as well. One is this Outlook junk mail reporting tool. But in the absence of that tool, maybe you're not running Outlook, maybe you're running Outlook web app, or maybe you're running just mobile devices. You don't need that tool. You can actually just forward the spam as an attachment to that abuse alias at Microsoft, and that will go into our clearinghouse, and then we'll evaluate it and add it to the body of knowledge we know about unwanted messages. So it's a fantastic way of helping us basically keep the internet clean and keep those unwanted messages out of your organization. You do want to send the message as an attachment, though. We need the whole envelope, we need the whole body, we need the whole headers and everything. So if you just forward the message, that's not really going to give us everything that we need to know. You need to actually have it sent in a separate email as an attachment to that email. And then the other, the converse of that is if you're getting false positives. In other words, if you're seeing messages that you know are legitimate, but they're getting marked as spam, you can also send that to the false positive alias. And in doing so, we'll be able to sort of clean up our database and we'll recognize that these are actually legitimate messages. If you do use the junk email reporting tool, as you can see here, it'll integrate right with the junk context menu inside of Outlook. And so that's this report junk feature that you get right there. And it's right above all the other controls that the individual end user has for dealing with unwanted spam. And again, that's just a free download from our download center. It integrates with pretty much every supported version of Outlook that we have out there. So there's no requirement to be running the latest version of Outlook. You can go and download that and run it against Outlook 2010 or even 2007 today if you want. Now, when you report messages as junk, you also get this yes and no dialog that says, after you report this, do you want us to move it to your junk email folder? We show this to you the first time. Most users are going to go ahead and check this box that says, do not show this message again. And then once they hit the report button after that, then we'll go ahead and silently report the message as junk and then silently send it to their junk mail folder. So we try to make it as easy and as low impact on the user as possible. Now, in terms of what you can do in terms of a response to spam messages, you have these notification capabilities. You have these sender notification capabilities, and you have these admin notification capabilities. Now, the admin notification capability, you'll decide to turn on basically depending on the level of spam that you get. Obviously, if you're getting a tremendous amount of spam, that may be something where you do want to notify the administrator so that they can look at the anti-spam policies that are in place and perhaps tweak them to reduce the amount of spam that's coming in. Maybe adjust the spam confidence level, maybe turn on some of the other filtering features and so forth. If you're not getting very much spam, then you might not want to bother the administrator with that information. If you get 1 or 2 messages a day, that's probably nothing that the administrator really needs to be concerned with. Now, in terms of the sender notifications, we do give you that ability, but most customers will do that for notifying internal senders. Most customers will not choose to notify external senders. The reason for that is, again, when you're notifying an external sender and that external sender is a spammer, well, you've just notified them that they had a legitimate mail message and or email address rather, and again, you're just lining their pockets with gold at that point. But telling internal senders is not always a bad idea, because the internal senders may not know that their account is being used to send spam. It's possible that their account was hacked and somebody is using it. It's possible that they left their desktop unlocked and someone is coming and fooling around, or maybe they've got some malware that inadvertently got installed on their machine, and now their machine, unbeknownst to them, is basically a bot that is sending spam out en masse. So perhaps notifying your internal folks might be of interest to you, but again, I would use caution with the external sender notification. All right, so let's talk about anti-malware. That's very similar to anti-spam. Again, you're going to be doing things like choosing whether or not to notify the sender and choosing whether or not to notify the administrator. And of course, you do have some granular controls, just like you do with spam. You can block the entire message. You can delete the attachments that are unwanted, the malware attachments, and then use the default alert text. Or you can block those attachments, or delete those attachments rather, and enter some form of custom text. Again, in terms of the admin notifications, if you're getting malware that's being sent to your organization via email, in that case, it's usually a pretty good idea to alert the administrator, even if the volume of malware you're getting is somewhat low. The reason being, the administrator might not be aware of current malware campaigns that are going on, and this gives them visibility about that. And it further gives them the ability to do things like tweak their transport rules to just go ahead and drop all messages that contain these unwanted attachments, rather than letting it get through a few layers of filtering first. Now, same thing with notifying internal and external senders. Generally, you're not going to want to notify the external senders because, again, they've sent you malware. And that could be something where it could be a legitimate sender, but they're infected, and so their machine is now sending that malware out as part of the cloning and reproduction process that malware often has. And as a result, instead of notifying them via an email, it might not be a bad idea to maybe call them on the phone, or send them a separate email outside to maybe an alternate address that you might have for them, so that the infected mailbox that's actually sending these messages doesn't become aware of your legitimate address. All right. Let's talk a little bit about policy and reporting. Now, in terms of policy and reporting, most of this is going to be found in both on-prem and inside the cloud service in terms of the policies. The reporting, as you'll see in a little bit, is really limited to Exchange Online and Office 365. Now, there is reporting that you can create on your own, because obviously you've got your message tracking logs and you've got other performance counters and other information that you can use to do that. But you would have to basically do all the heavy lifting to create the reporting infrastructure yourself. We do that for you in Office 365, and I'll show you what some of those reports look like. Now, in terms of policy management, there's basically the three criteria that we've been using in transport rules for some time. And that would be the conditions, or what we sometimes call predicates. And in fact, in the documentation, you'll probably see us eventually doing away with the term predicate and only using the term condition to refer to this piece of the function. And so those conditions could be things like where this message is from, what its size is, what attachments it has, et cetera, et cetera. And then we've got the actions. So once you find a message that meets these conditions, what actions do you want to take? Do you want to delete the message? Do you want to quarantine the message? Do you want to silently block the message? Do you want to modify the message or modify the message headers, etc.? And of course, we give you the ability to create exceptions as well, because there may be times where a legitimate sender does meet some of the conditions that you've created, but because they're a legitimate sender, you don't want this rule to apply to them, and as a result, you can create exceptions that basically eliminate that rule from processing their messages. You also have the ability to do some other things as well. You can defer the rule on processing failures. So in other words, if the system is overloaded and for whatever reason doesn't have the CPU or memory resources that are necessary to scan the message, and as a result you have a scanning failure, that message can be preserved inside the transport stack for later scanning once the system has available resources. We also have audit capabilities, so you can track historically how often these rules are being triggered. And that will give you a fairly good idea as to the effectiveness of your rules. And that's some of the reporting that we do inside of Exchange Online is we give you reports that basically audit how frequently these rules are triggered in your organization. You also have the ability to set time limits on rules. You can activate them at a specific date, and you can have them deactivated at a specific date as well. So they'll only apply for a date range, and in doing so, that can provide you protection against email campaigns, unwanted email campaigns that have started up suddenly without warning, but you know eventually you're going to have controls in place that prevent them from doing any damage. So let's talk a little bit about the conditions. Some of the conditions that you have available to you can be based on who the sender is, or who the recipient is, or what's in the subject or the body of the message, or whether or not there's attachments and which attachments they are, or what the message says, or a combination of sender and recipient or message properties, or the message header as well. So you can look at all of these various elements, various properties inside the message, inside the envelope as well, and use any of those available properties as conditions that trigger your rules. You also, for example, if we look at the sender, you can say, for example, is a specific person, or the sender is someone internal or external, or they're a member of this group, or they're using words or text patterns. An example of this is there may be a variety of domains that you know are always used to send unwanted messages. Often these are numeric domains only. They don't have any alphabetical characters in them. They're all numeric domains, 123.com example. So if you see any of those words or any of those text patterns, you can immediately block those things without having to go through a blocked domain. One of the reasons you might need to do that rather than just blocking a domain is, unfortunately, there is a limit to the number of blocked senders and blocked domains that you can have in your organization. It's a very high limit, but in a very large organization or an organization that gets a lot of unwanted messages, in theory, you could reach that limit, and this is another way to block those unwanted messages. You can also use IP address blocking as well, and this is something that has actually been in use for a while on the internet, using IP address or IP address range blockings. And in fact, you can, through some of the large internet service providers, they will publish a list of the IP address ranges for things like their dial-up users. Yes, believe it or not, some people still use dial-up. And for a dial-up user connecting to an internet service provider, all of their messages should always and only go through that internet service provider's SMTP servers. Those dial-up users should never be directly sending email messages to any organization. And so what you can do is, once you have that range of addresses, you can put in that range and block every dial-up user from that ISP from sending any messages directly to your servers. It's a great way to just shut out some of the spammers that are still operating in some of the countries where broadband has not reached what we would call penetration levels or majority penetration levels. And of course, the domain matches as well. In terms of the rule actions, you've got a whole lot of different things that you can do with these messages. You could block them, you could redirect them, you could modify, as I mentioned that. You can apply additional security. For instance, you could do things like require the messages to be sent using TLS security. So that wouldn't be necessarily blocking unwanted messages. That might be giving you greater security for certain messages that require it. Things that might contain personally identifiable information, or things that might contain sensitive or proprietary information. And you can do things like reroute the messages if you wanted to send them through a specific connector so that they can follow a specific delivery path. You have that capability as well. You can see some of the other things that you can do here as well, things like adding a disclaimer to the message, generating an incident report, quarantining the message, or as I mentioned, sending it through a specific outbound connector. Now the rule options. Now, as I mentioned, the rules can be configured to run for a specific period of time, and you also have the ability to run them in test mode. So test mode is slightly different from the real runtime of it. Test mode won't actually do it. It will just tell you whether or not it would have blocked the message or whether or not the message would have gone through. And so you can see some of the rule capabilities that you have here. Again, auditing these rules, activating and deactivating for a specific time frame, customizing the sender address, using TLS encryption, or enforcing and testing with and without notifications. If you are using any of the sender or admin notifications, generally we would recommend that you would test with notifications to verify that the notification aspect is working as well. Now, in terms of reporting, again, all the reports I'm going to show you come from Exchange Online. They're not available in the on-premises version, so you don't have a quick and easy way of getting reports for your on-prem deployments. But all of the information that we're using to create these reports in Exchange Online is available on your transport servers on premises as well. So you could construct these reports yourself. It's, I'll say it's not trivial, but it's not super difficult to do it as well. It's something that an administrator could spend a few days on, gathering the information, creating the scripts, and then putting it maybe through something like an Excel, like we do in the cloud, to go ahead and report in these nice graphs. So as an example here, here is where we're looking at your inbound spam. And we're looking at a variety of filters all in this one chart. So we can see the effectiveness of our content filter. We can see the effectiveness of the connection filter, of the SMTP filter, and then any custom filters that the admin might have created as well. And we can see this over a 7-day period, over a 14-day period, a 30-day, or a 60-day period as well. We also give you tabular results as well. So you can see who the top spam recipients are and the number of messages that they've received. And this is particularly helpful if you've got one or more users that are complaining about a large volume of spam coming into their mailbox versus other users in your organization that might have a much lower volume of spam as well. You can instantly look at the top recipients and maybe have a talk with those users and find out if it's something that they're doing that's causing them to be a target for spam, or if it's something else going on inside the organization. So to get to the reports, you simply go to the Office 365 Admin Center. You click on Reports, and then you can see we've got a variety of reports related to mail, related to protection, and related to rules. So the mail ones are really just about mailboxes and groups. Protection and rules would be the ones that are related to anti-spam, anti-malware, and so forth. So you can see things like malware detections that have been received in email, or malware detections from senders inside your organization, the top malware, the top spam recipients, and so forth. And then in the rules category down at the bottom, the rule matches for received mail and rule matches for sent mail as well. All these are freely available to all Office 365 Exchange Online tenants. And you can also download them as well. We give you the view here, but you can see over on the right, there's a download link that you get as well that downloads them, and then you just open them up in Excel, and you get the same reports that you would see through the website here. So as an example, the received mail report here. Again, we're looking at a variety of things. We're looking at good mail, which you can see in blue. We're looking at spam, which is in green. We're looking at malware, which we don't have any. It's actually below this red line here. We're also looking at mail that triggered the transport rules in gray. And then the DLP policy, if you're using data loss prevention as well. That's what this red line is indicating there. And again, you get the same views whether it's 7 days, 14, 30, or 60 days. Sent mail, it's a very similar report. We're just showing you all the same metrics, except this happens to be for your outgoing messages. All right, receive spam. Here again, we're looking at the report showing those number of messages that are blocked at the IP or the connection level filtering, the number of messages that are blocked at the content filtering level, and the number of messages that are blocked at the SMTP level, which would be the sender and recipient filtering. Malware detections. So here's the number of messages that had malware. This would be in your received mail. And you can see this large spike that we have there in the middle. Something was happening on that particular day, on the March 5th and 6th, where there was just some sort of malware campaign going on, maybe some Trojan or some virus or some other piece of malware that was going around. And in this case, this particular tenant was hit quite heavily with it. Then it tapered off a little bit, and then maybe it came back for a second round of unwanted mails. And this is very good for historical tracking purposes. You can identify trends, particularly here you're seeing the 14-day report. But if you look at something like the 30-day or the 60-day report and you start to see large spikes like that, you'll get a feel as to how much of a target your organization is for these unwanted messages. If you see just one of those spikes during the 60-day period, obviously you're not that big of a target. But if you see a whole bunch of spikes over and over again, then clearly your organization has somehow become a target of at least one malware sender, most likely multiple malware senders. And that just might be related to the type of organization you are. As you might imagine, for example, those of us with Microsoft.com addresses are fairly large targets for unwanted messages and for malware and things like that. But as you may have read in the press recently, it doesn't take a malware attack to hack us. We can be socially engineered into giving up passwords as well, unfortunately. So rule matches. Here's what we're doing is we're looking at the effectiveness of our rules. So this will only show up in a report if you are auditing the rule activity. And if you are auditing the rule activity, again, we break it down by the high, medium, and low severity. And those are designations that you assign to the rules that you create. So you decide what you would consider to be a high severity rule versus a medium or low severity rule. An example might be malware detection for a specific type of malware that can infect the system without any user activity. Once they open up the email message, boom, the system's been compromised. So in those cases, that would probably be a high severity type of audit trail. Low severity might be something where, yeah, it's an unwanted messages, but we're getting so many of them that we need to create a rule to block them out, but they're not as hostile as a high severity type of situation. So you might categorize that as low. All right, and as I mentioned, you have the capability to do your own self-service analysis using Excel. Excel can connect to our reporting web service that we have in the cloud, and it can get all the data from your tenant, all the statistics that we publish through these reports, and you can then drill down through all of the data in pretty nice looking reports. Both these charts that you see up here and this tabular report, and get a pretty good feel as to the types of messages that are coming and going throughout your organization. Now, message tracing, or what we sometimes call message tracking as well. This is your primary troubleshooting tool for troubleshooting mail flow problems. Most often, this tool comes into play when an end user says, someone sends me a message and I haven't gotten it yet, or I sent someone a message and they haven't gotten it yet. How can I find out what happened to that message? This is what we're doing here. We've got a very simple search interface where you can say, here's the sender or senders, here's the recipient or recipients, when was the message sent or received, what was the delivery status if you know it, and even better, what's the message ID. Then when you click on search, you get the results down at the bottom. Now, obviously, the search scope is limited to the Exchange organization. So whether you're online or on premises or in a hybrid configuration, the scope of this will only be within your organization. Once, obviously, a message leaves your organization, we have no visibility and no way of doing any tracking. But you will be able to see through this process that, in fact, the message did leave your organization. So you'll know that it's not stuck in some queue somewhere or in some outbox somewhere. You'll know quite surely that it has, in fact, left your organization. And now it's up to the receiving side to perhaps do some tracing on their end as well. If you are using Exchange Online protection, which every Exchange Online user, Office 365 user is using behind the scenes, whether they realize it or not, we only keep 7 days worth of data. So if you are doing message tracking for cloud-based messages, you're going to want to do that sooner rather than later. In the case of on-premises, you have control over how long you keep that data. By default, it's also 7 days, but you can go ahead and reconfigure that to 14 days or some other value that makes most sense for your organization. All right, let's talk about encryption. Now, when we talk about encryption, there's two forms of encryption. There's the encryption for the messages in transit or going over the network, and there's encryption for the messages at rest. So when we talk about the in transit, we're looking at transport layer security or TLS encryption. By default, in both on-premises and Exchange Online, opportunistic TLS is enabled. And what that means is when we're receiving a message from a server, we first query the server to see if it supports TLS, and if it does, TLS is automatically used. So TLS is a variant of SSL that will secure that communication pathway so that as the message is transmitted, anybody who might be sniffing the network will not be able to read the contents or anything related to that message. Beyond that, if you want to always require TLS, you can turn that on as well. You can force TLS for all messages. So if you're getting messages from a server that doesn't support TLS, that server simply won't be able to send you any messages. Most modern messaging servers, and by modern I mean anything that's newer than 10 years old, most modern email servers support TLS, and many of them, and particularly over the past 5 to 7 years, have opportunistic TLS turned on. So it shouldn't be that big of a problem for any customer to force TLS for all their connections. Now, that having been said, there are still some pretty old servers that are out there on the internet still capable of sending email messages, and there's a fairly good chance that those servers just don't support TLS or don't have opportunistic TLS turned on. So you might find that you're not able to accept messages from every single server out there. Whether or not you're actually impacted by that, well, that's something that your organization will have to figure out. Generally, what you might want to do is leave opportunistic TLS turned on, and then evaluate the number of messages, which you can see in your transport logs, that came through without using TLS. And if it looks like you're not seeing any messages come through that weren't protected by TLS, then you might safely be able to turn on forcing of TLS. If, however, through log analysis you find that there's a fair amount of messages that are coming through that aren't using TLS, then you might want to perhaps investigate that further. One thing that you could do is actually contact the administrator for the sending servers and tell them your server's not secure. It's sending messages in plain text, and that could be a security problem for that company. In terms of message level encryption, that can happen two ways. If you're using that in the cloud, that would be through the Exchange Hosted Encryption service, which I'll talk about in a bit. Or it could be using something like Windows Rights Management Services, both on premises, or Windows Azure Rights Management Services in the cloud as well. And the message level encryption generally does not require a lot of end user training. And in fact, depending on how you want to encrypt the messages, you could just have the messages encrypted automatically without the end user doing anything. Or you might create policies within your organization that could be exposed to the Outlook client where certain messages do automatically get encrypted, where other messages that don't meet that policy would not get encrypted. That could require a little bit of end user training so that they know which policy to choose from the drop-down. Now, in terms of Exchange Hosted Encryption, again, that's something where everyone using Exchange Online Protection is automatically also using Exchange Hosted Encryption as well. But it doesn't mean that we're encrypting every message. It's still up to that organization to turn those things on. And so basically, it allows you to send encrypted messages to any recipient without any administrative burden on your part or the recipient's part. Encryption is based on policy rules that are created by you. There are some default rules, but you basically have granular control over those policies, and they are enforced inside the Exchange Online Protection Cloud service. Now, I want to be very clear, though, when we talk about these messages going through this pipeline that you see up here, none of these messages are ever saved. All of this work is done in memory. They are not stored to disk. And none of the data, none of the messages are ever saved or persisted in any way by Exchange-hosted encryption. They come in, they're evaluated via the policy engine. If the policy engine determines they need to be encrypted, the message is encrypted, and then it's immediately sent on its way through the transport pipeline. Now, if you are using this, but you're not an EOP subscriber, there will be a cost for you, but only for the sender. There would be no cost for the recipient. So you can send encrypted messages to any recipient. Again, there's nothing for that they need to do on their end. And there's no cost to those recipients as well. And those recipients, because you've given them permission to decrypt the messages, those recipients can also reply to the message, and those replies will be encrypted. Or they can forward the message, and the forwarded messages will also be encrypted, again, with no cost whatsoever to whoever those recipients may be. Now, I mentioned RMS. So we're talking about now protecting messages while they're at rest. So that would be encrypting a message, or it might also be encrypting one of the common Office file formats, or even a third-party format like a PDF as well. And once that data, or once that message with its attachment is encrypted, it's not only encrypted at rest, but also while it's in motion as well. So as it goes to, say, for instance, an Office 365 recipient, that is also encrypted as it goes along. And for any client that recipient is using, it's also encrypted on the client as well. That could be a mobile device, it could be a tablet, it could be a laptop, it could be Outlook, it could be Outlook web app, and so forth. And one of the reasons RMS is so really preferred over some of the other approaches that you have to encryption is that it covers a variety of scenarios that simply aren't covered by some of the other encryption methods. Now, you might be using a combination of encryption methods. For example, you might be using BitLocker on your servers, depending on your policies on security and so forth. Or you might be using BitLocker on your laptops, like we all do at Microsoft. And you may be aware that Windows phone devices also use BitLocker for their encryption as well. And BitLocker is great for that. It protects the servers, it protects against lost hard drives, unlike RMS, which doesn't protect against a lost hard drive. But RMS covers all of the other scenarios. It can be used on premises, it can be used in the cloud. The encryption remains with the content, it can't be separated from it. The protection is tied to the user identity and to the policy, which controls what the user can do. For example, edit, reply, printing, and so forth. And it also allows you to do things like integrate with the content indexing, the e-discovery, the business intelligence, antivirus software, and so forth, other components and features that are integrated with Exchange itself. Now, SMIME is another popular form of encryption that we have, but it doesn't cover every single scenario. And for those of you running Exchange 2013, you know that we have not yet introduced SMIME for Outlook web app yet. That is coming in Service Pack 1, though, and we have stated that Service Pack 1 will be out in early 2014. So very shortly, once Service Pack 1 is released, you will have the ability to use SMIME with Outlook web app again with Exchange 2013. But even SMIME, even though it covers the majority of the scenarios listed here, it doesn't cover all of them. Really, RMS gives you the best protection in terms of Office 365, and when you combine that with BitLocker on your end-user workstations and end-user devices, you basically have full end-to-end encryption and protection for all of your messages. Enabling RMS inside of Office 365 is super easy. Literally, you go to the Rights Management tab in the Office 365 admin portal. You click on Activate. You wait just a very short time, and it's automatically enabled after that. There's also great information. If you're not familiar, if you haven't used Rights Management before, we've got a lot of documentation on the portal that will help you understand what it does. Once you do that, now you've got these RMS policies that can be applied, and that's through that permission button that you see on the options menu here. So we've tried to obscure a Microsoft.com email address there, but you can see it kind of comes out a little bit. But basically here, once you set permissions on this, now the policies that you create are admin driven, so the admin decides what policies are going to be and what the rights for the end user are going to be associated with that policy. So as an example, the difference between Microsoft Confidential and Confidential View Only, something that would be Microsoft Confidential means that any full-time employee at Microsoft will automatically be given rights through the RMS server to open up that message, to reply to that message, to view that message, obviously, to forward the message to another FTE at Microsoft, and to print the message if necessary. Confidential View Only restricts almost all of their abilities. All they can do is open up that message and read it. They can't forward it, they can't reply to it, they cannot print it. Now, of course, when we talk about blocking their ability to do things like printing and forwarding, obviously we can only take that so far. You know, any end user has, I'm sure, one of these devices, which includes a camera, and anybody can open one of these messages if they have rights to do so, take a picture of the screen, and then send that picture off to whoever. So that obviously is a pretty low-tech and unsophisticated workaround. But most folks are not going to do that. There will be some that might do that, and for sure there are, but most folks are not going to be able or not going to have a desire to share the kind of information that would be protected through RMS policies. That would typically be sensitive, proprietary, confidential, highly secure information that you wouldn't want shared outside the organization. Now, RMS can obviously be applied to emails, but it can also be applied to SharePoint libraries as well. So almost all of the file formats that you'll use inside of SharePoint can be protected through RMS. And you can also protect them if they're downloaded via a web app or if they're downloaded to a local machine. So regardless of the mechanism, if you're using like Word web app, for example, to open up a Word document from SharePoint instead of downloading it to your machine, that can be RMS protected. And if that file does end up getting downloaded to the machine, that RMS protection stays with the content and the policy stays enforced with that content. Now, RMS can also be applied to any Office document. So Excel, OneNote, PowerPoint, Visio, Word, obviously, any of the document types that we have in the Microsoft suite, in the Microsoft Office suite, all of those can benefit from RMS protection. And as you saw on the previous slide, let me back up here, just in case you missed it, down here at the bottom, you can also, if you're using Fox IT Pro or Fox IT Pro, you can also RMS protect PDF files as well. We can't do that natively. You do need a third-party product integrated to do that, but it is possible to do that, though. But all the Office, all the Office formats, we can do that natively. All right. Now, how do you know your data and private information are safe? Well, we've got this Office 365 Trust Center that I wanted to mention, and all of the Trust Center promises apply to Exchange Online Protection as well. So anything that we're doing in Office 365 and any of the statements that we make on that web page does apply to Exchange Online Protection. So if that's the only cloud service that you're using, you would still go to the Office 365 Trust Center in order to get that information. All right. So I did want to also talk a little bit about Exchange Online Protection. I do see that we are actually at the time limit right now, but I'm going to go ahead and just take maybe 2 more minutes to quickly go through a couple things that I wanted to mention. One thing that I wanted to mention is the service level agreements that we have. We do have 100% detection rate of all known viruses. So there are no known viruses that will escape our detection and make it through our system. We do have about a 99% spam detection rate. Obviously, spam is changing constantly. We cannot catch it all. But our rate of spam detection is very high. Again, 99%. Our false positive ratio is very low, about 1 in every 250 to 275,000 messages. And our uptime is very high. We're looking at about 5 nines. And these, by the way, these will apply just to EOP standalone customers, not to all of Office 365 when we talk about uptime or average delivery time. The average delivery time that we're looking at is generally under a minute. We're very fast in terms of our scanning and detection. Now, I also have some scenarios in here which you can go through, but I also included details about the actual internal architecture that we're using inside of EOP. Again, those of you who have been using Exchange for a while will recognize a lot of these layers because they're the same layers that we would use in Exchange on premises to do our filtering. So the same connection filtering, the same virus scanning, the same policy enforcements, and the same spam protections are all available there inside of EOP. All right. All right, so you've seen how both Exchange Server and Exchange Online include very robust anti-spam and anti-malware features. You've seen that the policies enable very fine granular control over incoming and outgoing messages, and reporting in Exchange Online in particular provides you a great view into what's going on in your organization. And both EOP and Exchange Hosted Encryption do provide protection for both on-premises and online mailboxes by supporting both hygiene and encryption policies. Now, I wanted to have time for questions, but obviously I'm out of time here. But feel free to catch me at the mingling later on after the sessions are over tonight. I'll be happy to answer any and all questions that you have. And if you can't think of any, feel free to send me an email message at any time. I'd be more than happy to help you out with any Exchange issues that you might have or any other questions that you might have. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you at the sessions tomorrow.